Eddie Lee Sexton was no ordinary man. He was a force of darkness, shrouded in crimes that defy comprehension, acts so twisted they leave only questions, lingering at the edges of sanity. This isn't a tale of justice, nor one of mere survival. It's about control, control so absolute it warps the will of anyone caught in its grip. What happens when the protector becomes the predator, when love is contorted into something monstrous? Evil doesn't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes, it sits smiling at the head of the table, while those around are too terrified to look away. We're about to venture into a world few could imagine. How far can control go before it consumes everything? And how does one escape a force bent on leaving no witnesses? There are no easy answers here. In the end, everyone pays a price, some with their freedom, others with their lives, and those who escape are left to bear the heaviest burden. This is the story of Eddie Lee Sexton, a man who demanded total control, a father who did more than commit unspeakable acts. He forced those closest to him to become unwilling accomplices. He was no protector, he was a tyrant, claiming to be Satan himself. Behind closed doors, his household was a kingdom of fear, where submission was survival. Every word, every action, served one purpose, to maintain his control, no matter the cost to his children. To the outside world, the Sexton family seemed like an odd but close-knit group. But beneath the surface was a nightmare. Eddie fathered children with his own daughters and ordered his children to kill, turning his home into a prison of unspeakable horrors. Between the late 1980s and 1994, Eddie's grip tightened, pushing the limits of manipulation from Ohio to remote campsites in Florida. His children became prisoners in both body and mind, rewarded for obedience and terrorized for defiance. In his world, loyalty was demanded in its most twisted form. In ways chilling beyond belief, Eddie Lee Sexton's daughters bore his children, and his sons became instruments of his twisted will, trained to execute his every command, no matter how horrific. But Eddie didn't settle for merely controlling their actions. He demanded dominion over their minds, their futures, and even their souls. Every act of defiance met with brutal punishment, and any hint of independence was swiftly crushed beneath his iron-fisted rule. In the swamps of Florida, as the law closed in, Eddie's grasp on reality grew even more distorted. When his daughter's infant son fell ill, he refused medical care, convinced that the power over life and death was his alone to wield. What followed was a heart-wrenching tragedy, the first in a spiral of murder, betrayal, and the ultimate disintegration of a family held together solely by fear. The nightmare only deepened when one of Eddie's sons, under his father's command, took the life of a man they had once called family. With a makeshift garrote and a soul scarred by years of torment, the young man carried out an act that would shatter whatever remained of the family's humanity. These crimes weren't simply acts of senseless violence. They were sacrifices on the altar of control, tributes to a father who demanded absolute power. By the time authorities apprehended Eddie and his family, the damage was irreparable. What they uncovered was more than a series of murders. It was a window into a world where love had been grotesquely twisted, where family bonds had become shackles, and where every relationship served as a weapon in the hands of a man devoid of mercy. This isn't merely a crime story. It's the tale of one man who dismantled the very essence of family and rebuilt it into a nightmarish realm under his own dominion. It's a narrative about the harrowing cost of survival, the steep price of obedience, and the crushing weight of a freedom that came far too late. This is the story of Eddie Lee Sexton, a man who saw himself as invincible, who played God with the lives of those he should have protected, leaving behind a legacy so dark that even death could not silence it. Eddie Lee Sexton was born the youngest of 10 children in West Virginia, a place where hardship was woven into everyday life. The death of his father in 1952 thrust young Eddie into a tumultuous world, and his troubling behavior soon escalated to frequent brushes with the law. His teenage years were spent in juvenile detention centers, foreshadowing a life marked by crime and manipulation. By 1963, Eddie was serving a 4.5-year prison sentence for robbery, the first of many moments that foreshadowed his path of destruction. But Eddie was no ordinary criminal. Over time, he crafted his family into an empire of fear and domination. He married Estella Mae Sexton, a woman as much a victim as an accomplice. Under Eddie's control, Estella became an enforcer of his twisted rules. Her role went far beyond silent compliance. She actively helped maintain Eddie's iron grip over their children. When he demanded submission from his daughters, Estella didn't hesitate to hold them down, ensuring their obedience. Any maternal instincts she may have had were crushed under Eddie's relentless control. She existed not as her own person but as an extension of his dark influence, too entangled in his manipulation to escape. Their daughter, Eddie Sexton Good, found herself at the heart of Eddie's horrific legacy. Manipulated from a young age, Eddie Sexton Good was groomed into a life where boundaries didn't exist, and escape felt like an unreachable fantasy. Entangled in her father's twisted world, Pixie bore 3 children, all conceived through a cycle of manipulation and abuse. Desperate to cloak the shame and confusion of her situation, she married Joel Good, hoping that marriage would conceal her 3rd pregnancy and allow her a chance at a new life away from her father's suffocating control. But breaking free from Eddie's grip was never an option. Even as Joel, a man with a gentle and loving nature, tried to protect her, he was powerless against the relentless reach of her father. Pixie's life spiraled into a complex web of emotions, love for her husband, fear of her father, and a dependence so deeply rooted that escaping felt unimaginable. Eddie's control over Pixie was as psychological as it was physical, binding her tightly in a web of love and fear carefully crafted over years. Then there was Willie Sexton, Eddie's son, whose life unfolded under the shadow of mental impairment and relentless trauma. Willie was more than just a follower, he was a puppet, conditioned from birth to obey without question. His cognitive limitations made him especially susceptible to Eddie's influence. When ordered to strangle Joel Good with a garrote, Willie complied, not out of malice, but because in his world, disobedience was unthinkable. Years of psychological torment had stripped Willie of any sense of autonomy, reducing him to a hollow shell, blindly executing his father's darkest commands. Eddie's children were more than mere victims, they were prisoners, isolated from society and denied any opportunity to build healthy relationships. The world their father created was the only one they knew, a world ruled by fear and submission. For Eddie, love was a weapon, a means of enforcing loyalty and absolute obedience. Disobedience was swiftly and brutally punished, reinforcing the notion that survival depended on total submission. Over time, Eddie's children lost all sense of identity beyond what he demanded of them, their wills so crushed that freedom itself became an alien concept. In the end, Eddie's control over his children went beyond mere power, it was about ownership. He had molded them into extensions of his will, tools to be used as he pleased. Isolated, broken, and conditioned to obey, they were trapped in a nightmare where even the thought of freedom was a distant, almost mythical fantasy. Their world revolved around one unwavering truth: Eddie Lee Sexton's rules were absolute, and defying them was unthinkable. The Sexton household was no ordinary family, it was more akin to a cult, with Eddie Lee Sexton as its deranged leader. Declaring himself Satan, he demanded absolute submission. Eddie's authority wasn't just exercised through control, he created an entire belief system rooted in fear, domination, and twisted rituals, all designed to shatter his children's spirits and bend them to his will. For Eddie, fear was the ultimate weapon, and he wielded it with surgical precision. From a young age, his children were taught that disobedience wasn't merely punished, it was unthinkable. Life under Eddie's rule was a meticulously constructed nightmare, a daily descent into ritualized control. Sons were forced to stand naked as Eddie compared their bodies, stripping them of any sense of dignity or privacy. Physical dominance wasn't enough for him, he sought to degrade them psychologically, stripping away their humanity layer by layer. For Eddie, every act was a calculated move to ensure that his children remained trapped in his orbit, bound by terror, with no hope of escape. Eddie's need to humiliate his children left psychological scars that would never fully heal. These weren't just acts of punishment, they were a brutal reminder that Eddie controlled every fiber of their existence. The rituals he imposed were grotesque beyond imagination. In one of the most harrowing incidents, Eddie orchestrated a twisted ceremony involving the family's pet. He slit the animal's throat and forced his children to drink its blood from a chalice, solidifying his dominance in a macabre ritual that blurred the boundaries between love, fear, and worship. For Eddie, these moments were not merely acts of cruelty, they were lessons in obedience, tests of loyalty, and proof that he held absolute power over life and death. The psychological toll on the children was staggering. Years of exposure to relentless trauma, humiliation, and manipulation left them struggling with developmental delays and severe mental health issues. Many displayed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and dissociation, a psychological survival mechanism in which the mind detaches from reality to endure unbearable situations. Living in a constant state of hypervigilance, they never knew when the next punishment would strike. Their lives were trapped in a mental prison from which there was no escape. Eddie's control infiltrated every corner of their lives. His children were not merely raised under strict rules, they were conditioned to believe that their very survival hinged on his approval. The punishments, the grotesque rituals, and the humiliations were not isolated events, they were woven into a larger system of psychological warfare designed to crush any hint of independence, making obedience the only means of survival. Over time, the children's identities were eroded, replaced by the roles Eddie had crafted for them. They weren't simply sons and daughters, they were tools, molded and wielded by a man who demanded complete and unrelenting control. In October 1993, the Sexton family's nightmare reached a heart-wrenching climax. Skipper, the infant son of Pixie Sexton Good, began showing signs of illness. Yet Eddie, paranoid and unyielding as ever, forbade any attempts to seek medical help. His distrust of the outside world was absolute, no doctors, no hospitals, no outsiders who could glimpse the twisted dynamics within his family. Skipper's cries echoed through the cramped campsite where the family was hiding, each wail a reminder that Eddie's grip over his family was beginning to slip. As the hours wore on, the child's cries grew louder, a sound that Eddie didn't hear as a plea for help, but as a threat, a crack in the tight control he maintained. To Eddie, the risk of exposure was intolerable. He turned to Pixie with a chilling command, silence the child, or he would do it himself. Caught between fear and brainwashing, Pixie did the unthinkable. In the dead of night, with her father's shadow looming over her, she pressed her hand over her son's tiny mouth. His cries faded into a final, desperate gasp, and then silence. Skipper's fragile body went still in her arms. Pixie had taken the life of her own child, not out of malice, but out of a warped sense of duty, a horrific sacrifice to maintain the fragile order Eddie demanded. But the horror didn't end with Skipper's death. In a delusional display of power, Eddie convinced the family that the baby's death wasn't final. He assured them he had the ability to bring the child back to life. For days, Pixie carried her son's lifeless body, clinging to the faintest flicker of hope that somehow the impossible would happen. Even death was not an escape in their twisted reality, it was another tool Eddie used to reinforce his hold over them. Eventually, the grim truth settled. Skipper would not come back. Following Eddie's orders, the family buried the baby in a shallow grave in a state park, laying him to rest clutching his rattle and pacifier, items meant to comfort him in life but now entombed with him in death. Yet the threads of Eddie's control began to fray. Joel Good, Pixie's husband, was haunted by a growing unease that gnawed at him. Skipper's death didn't sit right, the excuses, the strange behavior, all pointed back to Eddie. Joel longed for answers, and more than that, he wanted to bring his son's body back to Ohio for a proper burial. But Eddie, sensing that Joel might slip from his grip, saw danger in every word and look Joel gave. Suspicion was taking root, and Joel was becoming a threat to Eddie's tightly bound world. Eddie knew he couldn't allow his son-in-law to leave, he couldn't risk even the slightest chance that someone might go to the police. Skipper's death was only the beginning, a catalyst that set a chain of events into motion. But the story was far from over. The cracks in Eddie's dominion over his family were widening, and he was determined to stop them from spreading, no matter the cost. The tension within the Sexton family had reached a boiling point. With Skipper's shallow grave a constant reminder of Eddie's unbreakable control, Joel Good was becoming increasingly suspicious. He wasn't simply mourning the loss of his child, he was putting together the pieces of what had truly happened. His mind churned over the inconsistencies, the disturbing behavior, and Eddie's smothering grip on Pixie. Joel knew something was horrifically wrong, and he feared he was next. His desire to return to Ohio to give Skipper a proper burial was a threat to everything Eddie had built. And Eddie knew it. The mere thought of Joel going to the police was an intolerable risk for Eddie. If Joel escaped and spoke with the authorities, the dark empire Eddie had constructed would crumble, exposing the horrors buried in the family's past. To Eddie, there was only one solution: Joel had to be silenced, permanently. In the weeks leading up to Christmas 1993, Eddie began grooming his son, Willie, for the unthinkable. With Willie's cognitive impairments and years of trauma, Eddie knew his son could be bent to his will. Day by day, he drilled him, training him to use a garrote, teaching him to make the kill quick, precise, and silent. The garrote became more than just a tool, it was a symbol of Eddie's control, a weapon to ensure that Joel would never escape or reveal their dark secrets. The night came in late December, just before the holidays. Eddie gave the final command, and Willie, weighed down by a lifetime of obedience, led Joel into the woods. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, the kind that descends before something unspeakable unfolds. Each step they took into the dense forest brought Joel closer to his fate, though he was still unaware of the horror awaiting him. His mind likely replayed the loss of his son, trying to untangle the twisted reality of the family he had married into. Then, without warning, Willie struck. He slipped the garrote around Joel's neck, pulling tight, following his father's instructions with mechanical precision. Joel struggled, gasping for air, but Willie's grip held steady, his mind numb to the brutality of the moment. In that terrible instant, Willie wasn't just his father's son, he was Eddie's weapon. As the life drained from Joel's body, so too did any hope of escaping the nightmare that was the Sexton family. After the murder, Willie and his siblings stood paralyzed, each grappling with the weight of what had just happened. Flashbacks of their father's control flickered through their minds, moments they had dared to resist, only to be pulled deeper into his grip. In the cold, unforgiving stillness of the forest, they buried Joel as they had buried Skipper. But this grave was more than a final resting place, it was a warning, a grim reminder that in Eddie's world, there was no room for defiance. The days that followed were marked by a haunting silence. Willie, who had only known how to follow orders, was now tormented by the reality of what he had done. Pixie, too, spiraled deeper into despair, caught between guilt, grief, and the haunting fear that Eddie's control would never loosen. Each sibling unraveled in their own way, struggling to reconcile the horrors they had been forced to carry out with the faint, distant hope that they might one day escape Eddie's iron grip. But the truth loomed large: as long as Eddie remained in control, none of them would ever be free. With Joel's murder, Eddie and Estella Sexton knew their time was running out. With law enforcement closing in and suspicions around Skipper's death festering, the family had no choice but to disappear. They packed their lives into cramped vehicles and fled Ohio, taking several children and grandchildren along in their twisted exodus. Their plan was simple: stay hidden, stay together, and keep Eddie's grip unbreakable. But even on the run, Eddie's control didn't wane, it only tightened. They drifted from place to place, hiding in remote campgrounds and isolated state parks across Oklahoma, Indiana, and Florida. At each stop, Eddie continued to wield fear as his weapon, drilling his children in paramilitary-style exercises, convincing them that a final confrontation with law enforcement was inevitable. In his warped worldview, police, strangers, and even kind passers-by were all enemies, lurking threats ready to tear the family apart. For Eddie's children, escape didn't feel like an option. Survival meant complete, unquestioning obedience, no matter how irrational Eddie's orders became. Their existence on the run was chaotic and surreal. 11 people, adults, children, and grandchildren, crammed into makeshift homes, often sleeping in vans or tents, huddled together in fear of discovery. They stayed in one place only as long as they could, always glancing over their shoulders, always ready to move at a moment's notice. Eddie allowed no room for mistakes. If anyone slipped up, if anyone showed even the faintest sign of rebellion, the consequences were swift and brutal. The children knew that Eddie's reach extended beyond words, his power was embedded deep within their very sense of self. As long as Eddie drew breath, there was no escaping his control. But Eddie's own arrogance became his undoing. Even while on the run, he craved for the world to know his power. He documented the family's bizarre, disturbed existence in self-made videotapes, capturing everything from his delusional rants to their eerie rituals. One of these tapes, a brazen display of his dominance, was mailed to then-Attorney General Janet Reno. The return address on the package provided just enough information for investigators to track the family's movements, and they closed in on him with growing certainty. On January 14, 1994, FBI agents, working with local law enforcement, cornered the Sextons in a supermarket parking lot in Florida. Eddie, Estella, and the children were taken into custody, bringing their life on the run to an abrupt end. The arrest was the first fracture in the nightmare Eddie had constructed, a nightmare that spanned multiple states, leaving behind a trail of fear, manipulation, and death. With Eddie behind bars, the illusion of safety he had created began to crumble. Yet, even in custody, Eddie's presence lingered, a dark shadow that reminded his children his control had been more than physical. He had sculpted their reality, and breaking the chains he had forged would take far more than just a pair of handcuffs. The investigation into Eddie Lee Sexton had only just begun, but the echoes of his twisted reign would haunt his family long after his empire had fallen. As authorities began to piece together the events surrounding Eddie Sexton and his family, they quickly uncovered a horror far darker than anyone had imagined. Beneath the surface festered years of abuse, incest, and two chilling, calculated murders, all orchestrated by a father who demanded absolute control. Each revelation peeled back layers of not just heinous crimes but of twisted manipulation Eddie had wielded over his children, leaving a legacy of confusion, terror, and psychological torment in its wake. The interviews with Eddie's children were chaotic, filled with contradictions and gaping holes, underscoring the deep scars trauma had left on their minds. Willie, Pixie, and their siblings gave conflicting testimonies, each struggling to tell the truth while still haunted by the shadow of their father's control. Some moments seemed too painful to recall, others were clouded by years of emotional manipulation. Reality and Eddie's distorted world had blurred so profoundly that the children could no longer distinguish one from the other. Willie, mentally impaired and deeply scarred, initially resisted confessing to Joel's murder. But the weight of what he had done, coupled with years of Eddie's relentless control, finally shattered his defenses. He admitted to the strangulation, his voice heavy with regret and resignation, revealing the horrifying extent of his father's influence. Pixie, too, recounted the suffocation of her own son, Skipper, not with anger, but with a hollow emptiness, the result of years under Eddie's suffocating grip. Each testimony served as a painful reminder of Eddie's dominance, even as he sat behind bars. When the case went to trial, Eddie's demeanor shocked the courtroom. He remained disturbingly detached, showing no hint of remorse or regret. Witnesses described his icy composure throughout the proceedings, even when the jury recommended the death penalty. He merely shrugged and muttered, "That's life," a chilling display of the control he still believed he held. One defense attorney later reflected, "He was quiet but calculating, you could tell he was still in control," highlighting the eerie, pervasive influence Eddie maintained even in his darkest hour. The trial of Eddie Lee Sexton unfolded as a harrowing showcase of control, fear, and manipulation. Testimonies from Pixie and Willie painted a vivid picture of the horrors they had endured. Pixie recounted how Eddie had ordered her to silence her son Skipper, describing how love, fear, and duty had been tragically distorted in her mind. Willie's testimony revealed the terrifying depth of Eddie's influence, admitting that Joel's murder wasn't a choice, merely another command he had been conditioned to follow. The defense attempted to shift responsibility, casting the children as willing participants rather than victims, painting Eddie as a misunderstood patriarch and questioning the reliability of Willie's and Pixie's accounts, given their trauma and inconsistencies. However, the prosecution countered with searing arguments. They emphasized the psychological abuse Eddie had inflicted, presenting him as a puppet master who manipulated his children into committing unthinkable acts. Through testimonies and evidence, the court saw the web of control Eddie had spun around his family, demonstrating how thoroughly it permeated every decision they made. The trial concluded with Eddie's conviction on multiple counts, including murder and conspiracy. He was sentenced to death, though he continued a series of appeals, claiming that his past behavior and his children's testimonies had biased the jury. Despite his efforts, the death sentence was upheld, solidifying his place among the most notorious criminals of his time. With the verdict handed down, attention turned to the future of the Sexton family. Willie, considered mentally impaired, accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder, receiving a 25-year sentence. He was released in 2007, but his life remained marked by the trauma inflicted by years of subjugation under Eddie. Pixie also entered a plea deal, admitting to manslaughter for her role in Skipper's death. Although spared a harsher sentence, she struggled to rebuild her life, burdened by the emotional weight of what she had been coerced into under her father's domination. Eddie Lee Sexton's story ended on December 29, 2010, when he died of natural causes in a Florida prison. Until the very end, Eddie never expressed an ounce of remorse for his actions. His wife, Estella Del May Sexton, also convicted for her role in the abuse and manipulation, died behind bars as well, leaving a haunting legacy of suffering that would scar their children for years to come. The surviving members of the Sexton family have faced immense challenges in their efforts to heal. Many grappled with post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociation, and other deep psychological wounds carved by years of abuse. Charles Sexton, one of the brothers, worked tirelessly to break the cycle, raising his children in a home free from the terror he had endured. Yet the trauma lingers, each sibling haunted by the memories of what their father had done, long after his death. The Sexton family's story remains a chilling testament to the lasting impact of abuse and manipulation, a stark reminder of the thin line between control and destruction. The story of Eddie Lee Sexton forces us to confront unsettling questions about the nature of evil within families and the ways in which darkness can be disguised behind the facade of authority. How do we reconcile the painful truth that those entrusted to nurture and protect can become the very source of destruction? The Sexton case isn't just a story of murder, it's a study in the profound, lasting impact of unchecked control, manipulation, and abuse. Could these tragedies have been prevented if someone had intervened sooner, or was the power Eddie held over his family simply too complete, too corrosive, for anyone to escape until it was too late? The psychological implications of familial abuse are staggering. Eddie's manipulation created an endless cycle of fear and dependency that permeated every corner of his children's lives. When control becomes a weapon, the boundaries of trust and love disintegrate, leaving only obedience and terror in their place. Even after Eddie's death, the shadow of his abuse lingers heavily in the lives of his children, many of whom still grapple with the deep trauma he inflicted. But the social implications reach far beyond one family, raising difficult questions about the systems meant to protect vulnerable children and the signs that went tragically unnoticed. Eddie's actions stand as a chilling reminder of the devastating power of manipulation. His influence looms large even in death, a haunting testament to the fragility of trust and the ease with which power can be twisted into a weapon. For those left behind, the challenge lies not only in healing but in ensuring that such horrors are never repeated. This case compels us to ask, how many other families live under the weight of control and fear, hidden behind closed doors? How many lives could be spared if we recognized the warning signs sooner? These questions have no simple answers, but they are questions we cannot afford to ignore. Eddie Lee Sexton's legacy remains a reminder of how power, fear, and manipulation can dismantle lives. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more in-depth stories like this.